I'm Jordan Siegel, and I'm joined by my co-host Jacob Efron. On today's episode, we have Aran Komatsuzaki, lead scientist for EleutherAI, where he was the chief architect behind the largest open source model in the world at the time it was released, GPT-J. He's also a member of Lion, one of the leading nonprofit AI research institutes, which contributed to Bloom, Stable Diffusion, Imagen, and OpenFold. We talk about the latest in AI research.
The area I'm most excited with, at least within the LLM field, is the idea of thought cloning.
He discusses the incredible gap between top AI companies and everyone else.
Even if, say, Elon Musk just spends $10 billion on model training, but he still cannot compete with OpenAI. These researchers and engineers, they do not really care about money. They simply want to work with other top researchers or engineers, so they want to go to places like Google or OpenAI.
And of course, we asked Aran about his predictions for AGI.
Probably it's gonna take very little amount of time until we achieve actual AGI.
Hope you enjoy the episode. Aran, we're big fans of your Twitter, so we're very excited to have you on board today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
To start, it would be great, and I'm sure our audience would love to hear a little bit more about yourself and what got you into AI in the first place.
Yes, I was, just like many other machine learning researchers, I was very fascinated with the idea of AGI. So when I was a child, I wanted to become a mathematician, physicist, a music composer, and biologist, and many different jobs. And I realized that if I can build a machine learning model that can behave as a researcher or like artist of many different domains, then I don't have to become a mathematician myself. So I thought that was like the most straightforward path for me.
Awesome. And then, what attracted you to Eleuther?
When EleutherAI was founded, there weren't really any active machine learning Discord servers. So most of the discussions were happening in Twitter or Reddit. And the latency was not really good compared with chat. So I personally prefer chat format over Twitter or Reddit. And I was just invited my friend to join this EleutherAI Discord server. And I was personally very interested in GPT-3. So I just joined their project. And I didn't join their GPT Neo or Pile project personally, but I started becoming more serious when DALL-E was released by OpenAI. And my project surrounding DALL-E led to Lion 400 million project and GPT-J project.
Yeah, how did you, it's such an interesting set of products you've worked on there. Like, how did you even originally decide to work on GPT-J in the first place?
So actually, GPT-J originally was just a DALL-E deprecation project.
Really?
The thing is that DALL-E, for producing DALL-E, we need a few things. Firstly, you need a huge image text dataset. And actually that became a Lion dataset later. So, unfortunately, we could not replicate it in EleutherAI community. But my project sort of motivated the similar project as Lion Discord server. So their lead, Christoph, was originally in EleutherAI server, and he was following my project, and we sort of paired. So we brought this project to Lion server and continued. And that was for the Lion project. And for GPT-J, so for reproducing DALL-E, there are two components. One is encoder-decoder model, and another one is transformer language model for generating the values. And this component is pretty much the same as GPT-3. So, except for the difference in data. So we decided that we can build this library that can do both DALL-E prior and GPT-3. Then we can do one stone with two birds. So then there are a few improvements in with this library. Firstly, it was written in JAX, unlike TensorFlow, which was used for GPT Neo, and inference was much faster with JAX than TensorFlow. So that was a major selling point for our library. And we also made sure that we also solved some of the issues with GPT Neo, which was probably the training instability. And so we shuffled the dataset much better than GPT Neo, and we added a few improvements, which led to the fact that GPT-J was the first model to replicate a smaller version of GPT-3 with performance comparable to GPT-3's small 6 billion version. And because GPT Neo was the performance was not really comparable to GPT-3 3 billion or 2 billion model. So I think that was the measure.
Super cool. I mean, would love to hear a little bit more on sort of how you went about gathering the data for Lion and GPT-J. Obviously, today the data set is sort of the crown jewel and what we're seeing as differentiator for a lot of these models.
Yeah. For GPT-J, we simply used the same dataset as GPT-Neo, which was the Pile dataset. It was built during the first 6 months or 4 months of EleutherAI organization. And basically, we had about a dozen of contributors for each subcomponent of the dataset. And the Pile was to simply replicate the dataset used for training GPT-3 with additional components such as stack exchange and many different smaller sub-datasets to improve the diversity, which was slightly lacking with GPT-3 as original training dataset. And I was personally not involved with the development. It was led by Leo Gao, who was one of the co-founders of EleutherAI, and now he's in OpenAI. So, yeah. And as for Lion datasets, we just tried to faithfully replicate the dataset used for DALL-E training. And so it has about 400 million data, image text pairs. As for how we built the dataset, just like the dataset which was built for DALL-E training, we simply collected links from Common Cloud. So Common Cloud is a set of web pages cloud across webs, and it was used for the Pile as well. And we just looked for the links for images, JPG or PNG, and we simply tog those links and accompanying text. And yeah, that was not. And that was this process is kind of expensive if you just naively collect some of the all the images, but some of us came up with some tricks which made it slightly more affordable, and we could do it with a reasonable amount of budget.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And you were doing all this like while you were in school?
Oh, actually, I think back then I was taking a break from school because it was during COVID. So yeah, I typically don't spend much time for my school project. Most of my projects are coming from externally, like EleutherAI.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. Super interesting. And I guess, it might be helpful for our listeners just to kind of contextualize. Obviously, Eleuther is one of the main, open source efforts out there. Just kind of the history of Eleuther and some of, and the open source AI community in general. I think would be, folks would be super interested in that.
Yeah. EleutherAI is an open source research Discord community of machine learning. And it was founded about 3 years ago. So 2020 summer, after GPT was released. The original objective of the this community was to reproduce an open source GPT-3. Even though it was not achieved strictly in the strict sense, we could open source and reproduce some of the smaller version of GPT-3 and other models. And for the first 6 months, it was spent mainly for developing the Pile dataset and GPT-Neo model. And the next 6 months, some of the major milestones include GPT-J and yeah, and Lion dataset it was not exactly the contribution from EleutherAI side, but some of us worked with Lion to build this dataset, which, yeah. And after that, some of the people built this model called GPT-Neo-X, which is a 20 billion GPT-3-like model. And they later developed this suite of models, it's called Pythia, and it's basically a GPT-3 with many different sizes, from 12 billion to 100 million parameter models. And this is quite useful for doing research with interpretability and many different kind of experiments with GPT-like models without spending ridiculous amount of compute. And after that, I think most of the focus of the EleutherAI was to interpretability projects. Yes.
Eleuther was sort of founded on the principle of open source models, and you played a huge role in GPT-J and others you mentioned. There's this, sort of battle between open source models and closed source models right now, where the proprietary models are sort of in the lead from a performance standpoint. I mean, do you think open source models will catch up at some point? And, how will that happen if you think it will?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult for open source models to catch up with closed source models, primarily because I think there's this general trend of the winner becomes more successful. So I think there's this huge gap between top players such as OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google, and other lesser players, including open source communities as well. So for example, in the case of EleutherAI or Lion, we never at the same level as OpenAI in terms of technical expertise or anything. So I'd say so far there's no evidence that we're going to catch up with OpenAI anytime soon or Google, and not to mention that. If you want to build a model like GPT-4, you need at least nearly $100 billion, which is extremely difficult to spend for open source models, because open source models are much harder to capitalize compared to these closed source models. So yeah, even though I'm very passionate with open sourcing large language models, I'd say this. I'm not super. I'd say the chance is very small.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it seems like there's certainly some folks that think you'll need massive amounts of compute to stay state of the art in large language models, and then other folks that are like, well, look, these models get so much cheaper to train over time, and is there actually that much returns to throwing more compute at these models? I think even it's still unclear how much actual increased parameter size GPT-4 was versus just a better mixture of experts model. And so I guess, do you kind of fall in the camp of, hey, the cutting edge models are always going to require compute that's kind of out of the spend range of open source?
Oh yeah. So I should also mention that you need a lot of budget for other components. So compute is obviously one of the major factors. Another major factor, well, two of them, I'd say the researchers, how many top researchers and engineers you have, and how much you can spend on the dataset part. More specifically, I'd say supervised fine-tuning and RLHF component. So this dataset is actually expensive. Maybe not as expensive as the amount of money you spend on compute, but it is expensive, especially for supervised fine-tuning. And most importantly, the number of top researchers and engineers you have. So there's a clear gap between top players like OpenAI or Google versus other smaller players. So for these top researchers and engineers can come up with like a good design for the pipeline, like training data sets, like how to design good data and how to and nowadays they don't even release all their research findings by archive. So and those kind of knowledges. So even if say Elon Musk just spends like $10 billion for model training because he can't have all these top researchers and engineers, so he still cannot compete with OpenAI. And these researchers and engineers, they do not really care about money. They probably simply want to work with other top researchers or engineers. So they want to go to places like Google or OpenAI. So yeah, that kind of, I think that's a major barrier, I'd say.
So it sounds like if you're an investor, you would not bet against OpenAI.
I think so.
And so if OpenAI is sort of, that far ahead of the curve, maybe Anthropic and Google as well, do you think there's room for companies that are creating LLMs for very specific use cases, whether it's verticalized use cases or code generation or things like that? Or do you think companies will just end up taking OpenAI or another, LLM and fine tuning it?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And if you look at the historical trend of machine learning, everything is that there's a definite trend of every model becoming more and more generalist than specialist. So, for example, before GPT-2, many of the models were specifically trained for one or a few tasks. But after GPT-2, the major trend is multitask learning and generalist. And even though until recently, these generalist models' performance was pretty poor, I compared with single specialized models. But nowadays, GPT-4's performance is often so much better than specialist models. For example, if you compare MedPalm, which is a palm specialized on medical domain, if I recall correctly, their performance is comparable to GPT-4, even though GPT-4 was not specialized on medicine. So the reason why this happens is that first the GPT-4's reasoning capability is pretty good, even though its data, fine-tuning data was probably not specifically on the domain of medicine. As long as you have good reasoning skills and large enough pre-training data set, which necessarily contains medical knowledge, then you can still perform well on the area of medicine. And because the training, the entire pipeline is agnostic to any particular domain, so you can expect the same strong performance on many different domains, including code generation and So I'd say, so another thing is that if you make your model generalist, you can invest more on your model and you can spend more time and budget on your models and expect higher returns from this model because it can be used on many different tasks. So the customer base is probably bigger. So all these factors sort of lead to stronger generalist, aiming for generalist models rather than specialist models. Yeah, so that's my personal opinion, I'd say.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I mean, I guess I'm curious then, obviously, you're seeing people use, your own open source models today. As you think about then where folks will use open source models going forward versus the state of the art closed source models, both today and then in the future, where do you think these open source models fit in?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure if this is my response is going to be relevant to what you are trying to ask, but I think the presence of open source model is going to force the companies with closed source models to be more I think they want to reduce their price to be competitive, even though So if even though I say closed source models performs much better than open source models, if you apply these models on easier tasks, then the performance gap is not so big because if the task is easy, even the weaker models can perform well. So, for example, ChatGPT is much cheaper, 10 times cheaper than GPT-4, if I recall correctly. And so, and I think there are many tasks where you can simply use ChatGPT and you don't need a GPT-4. And so I'd say that the existence of open source model adds another layer to it. So, the best open source model sets determines the price of the weaker low tier version of the closed source models. So I think it may be the contributing factor for why OpenAI reduced the ChatGPT to their current price. So yeah, I think I like this this kind of pressure.
Yeah, so as long as open source keeps evolving, it puts the pricing pressure on the closed source players. And then I guess over time, probably whatever that lowest tier of capabilities is, expands and expands, right? As just the models get stronger and stronger.
Exactly.
Switching gears a little bit, I mean, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're big fans of your Twitter, and you do an awesome job of sharing, the latest research in the space. And we'd love to hear a little bit about some of the most interesting areas that you're excited about.
Yeah. And the area I'm most excited with, at least within LLM field, is the idea of thought cloning. So there was this paper titled "Thought Cloning" released in the beginning of this month, and I think it was released from Jeff Clare's group. And the idea is to basically, so the paper advocates for clones that thought steps that happens inside human brain. And their experiment was very simple, not like it's a very toy problem. So they had like a very simple video game, and they verbalized their future action into natural language. And so it's essentially verbalizing this thought step that happens, say, humans, before acting according to this thought. So there's not much to say about this paper, but I personally have this extended version of this idea. So, for example, when you write an article, you do not simply start an article like how GPT-4 does. GPT-4 simply starts from top to bottom in the page with that immediately. But that's not how humans do. Humans write an article. We typically start with some brainstorming and some ideas to think about or write about. Then we continually refine and reflect on these ideas and elaborate any of them. And then we may possibly add or remove some of these ideas. Then once we decide all these ideas, then we probably start writing. Maybe we have to brainstorm how to translate these ideas into the concrete format, which how we should start the opening paragraph or ending paragraph, or like should we change the position, like the order of presentation. All these things happen, which is why we spend maybe hours before finishing the article. Unlike GPT, which most of GPT's way of writing an article is very immediate and doesn't seem to have much thought into it. So I think the way how humans spend time for doing this kind of work, we spend most of the time in the internal discussion, internal monologue. I think this kind of so if we want to encode this kind of process into large language models, then I do have some ideas. For example, when we write an article, let's say an annotator writes an article, And when he writes an article, he has to verbalize every thought steps that happens in the brain and write it down one by one. And it may not be quite accurate, but I think we have to do some experiments like that. And just writing all the thought steps that happens and all the outputs that human writes on the editor. And if we fine-tune and large language models on this kind of data, hopefully the model learns some of the internal processes that happens in the brain. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking about. And I think other people have similar ideas. And I think this kind of process may happen in the future language models.
Awesome. Super interesting. We also understand that you're working on something in the video space, a video model of sorts. I mean, I think our audience would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. So we are collecting computer activity dataset with many different modalities. So we are letting annotators to use computers, laptops, and do many kind of tasks. For example, playing video games, watching YouTube videos, or doing many different kind of so like browsing internet, finding information, and using apps. And we are recording those processes using video screenshot, audio, mouse and keyboard inputs, and even eye movement tracking. So eye movement is actually often overlooked in machine learning and today. I think it's super important because the way humans the visual inputs for human eye is quite different from the visual inputs for camera or video camera. So in the case of video camera, each input frame is like 1,000 times 2,000 pixels, which is very expensive. But on the other hand, human eyes only process a very small region around the center of the eye, and it's like probably like 100 times 100 pixels, and every region around that is processed in a very blurry manner. So I'd say you can downsample those regions into very small square, and so that means you can process very small number of pixels per time frame. And I think this kind of approximation is needed for future video models. Otherwise, you have to spend a lot of compute on each frame, which is kind of infeasible.
Really interesting. You know, sort of thinking back to our earlier conversation on generalized models versus specific models, and OpenAI, you know, they're moving toward a multimodal world. They already deal with image. You know, do you think there's room for a generalized perception model that would have the sort of same level of effect in the video space as LLMs did on text?
Yeah, I think so. By the way, this is just a rumor, but I heard that OpenAI's next target or next project is involved with extending GPT's capability to video side. So yeah, I think there are going to be many players working on video, and obviously for the reason I stated, it's going to be quite useful for web tasks on web, and also it is very much needed for playing video games better. And so right now, there are some models that perform well on Minecraft, but obviously it cannot complete the entire game from the beginning to the end. It's just for some processes like building So I'm guessing that in a few years, there's going to be an agent that can complete Legend of Zelda or Dark Souls or any very long video games and from beginning to the end.
And do you think that, obviously some folks think, the kind of combined power you get from having models that understand, text, image, video together, will kind of reinforce the strength of the underlying model versus having these standalone kind of like LLMs, text to image, text to video, like Do you think there ends up, being kind of bespoke models in each kind of modality, or you end up with one kind of overarching model that kind of understands all different sorts of inputs and outputs?
I think by the general trend of generalist to a generalist model, I think there's going to be just this one model that can do everything. But one thing I recently noticed is that when you combine image generation model with the image representation model and large language models, there's not much synergy happening. So yeah, for some reason. So it doesn't necessarily improve the image generation capability. So maybe some of the tasks can be separated. But in general, I think it makes a lot of sense to just combine everything together. And I see that there are some evidences that combining language models with video models improve the video models capacity quite a lot. So I'd say it's going to be something like what happened with GPT-4. So GPT-4 has both text-only model and image-text model. So I think that kind of resource is that kind of way of releasing models is going to be popular. So the reason why this is good is because once you train, so training large language model is going to be very, very expensive. But once you have this model, you can fine-tune this model combined with, say, image or video component. And that part is actually probably not as expensive. So yeah, then this model may not perform as well as purely text models on purely text tasks. And having text-only model is quite flexible for many different kind of customization. So I think this kind of trend is going to continue.
For years, sort of the relationship between industry and academia, industry has sort of led in certain areas of AI research, such as computer vision and others. And now obviously on the LLM side, obviously you just finished graduate school, and would love to just hear your thoughts on sort of the role of academia going forward into the future, particularly in the LLM space.
Yeah. So the influence of academia in terms of large language models and state-of-the-art machine learning models, I think it's going to further diminish. So it was already in decline, and I think this trend is going to continue further. But one thing, but still, academia is like the major source of young researchers in the form of PhD students, and many good engineers are coming from PhD as well. And for example, in the case of Google, even though some of the engineers who just joined them and as a machine learning engineers after getting a bachelor's or a master's degree, some of them decide to become a machine learning researcher, and they just go to Stanford or Berkeley or other PhD program. So even though there are some successful researchers who just directly, there are some engineers who directly become a machine learning researcher inside Google or Meta, but that's not exactly easy to do. So I believe that many of them just go to PhD and then later go back to the original company and become a researcher. So I think this pipeline is not going to change anytime soon. But one thing I don't like about is that the quality of faculty members or their research is not particularly high outside of a few top labs, like UC Berkeley or Stanford, or so there isn't much opportunity in general, but there are some opportunities out there.
Well, look, we always like to end our interviews with kind of a quick fire round where we give you some questions and get your quick takes on them. And so maybe to kick it off, would just be curious, for one thing that you think is overhyped and one thing you think is underhyped in AI today.
Yeah, there are many things that are overhyped in general, I'd say. Yeah, sometimes, speaking of open source models, some of the models are definitely overhyped. Like, for for example, even though some of the models perform pretty well, according to human evaluation on summarization or writing an article, but I bet you guys have seen some of the reports on Twitter that these models, open source models, are not really good at knowledge intensive tasks like some multiple choice academic questions. So yeah, open source models tend to be overhyped. Also, there was this overhype on was it? I think this agent type model based on GPT-4 that was overhyped a few months ago, and we don't hear about that anymore. I don't remember the name. So yeah, there's a lot of overhype recently in machine learning because all the influencers from crypto and other areas are coming to machine learning. So unfortunately, that's happening, and many of the conventional ML influencers and knowledgeable people are really complaining about that.
Yeah. What about underhyped?
Okay. This may be a bit different, but I think the contributions from individual researchers tend to be often overlooked. Is this related or?
No, that's great. Anyone in particular you want to shine a light on that you think's been underhyped?
Yeah. So I often hear that, for example, in the case of stable diffusion, there's a Robin Lombard, this researcher named Robin Lombard. His contribution was often overlooked, and many people attribute the success of this model to, say, like a CEO or whoever was the top of the company. So I see this general trend, maybe not limited to machine learning, but a lot of credit is assigned to CEO or whoever was the most famous among the authors, all the others in the paper. So I think that's very unfortunate. And yeah, if you just forget about it, and if you could properly attribute credits to the person who actually worked on the work, then you can probably, even as an investor, you can just look at this person, and maybe if he leaves the company and founds a startup, then you can you can trust these people more.
That happens in my work too. Jordan always overshadows me in all the stuff we do together. It's tough. But I guess, another one on the quickfire side, what are your thoughts on AGI? Is it possible, and what time frame?
Yeah. I'm guessing that it's going to happen. So, okay, before speaking about AGI, I think what we should aim for is a machine learning model that can do machine learning research better than humans do. As long as we can build a model like that, then we don't have to do anything, and we just have to wait for this model to just keep working on machine learning research. And probably it's going to take very little amount of time until we achieve actual AGI. And so we want machine learning models to do research, so without any human assistance. For that, there are a few things we have to solve. For example, the context of length of the current large language models is very limited, unlike humans. And we humans typically remember what happened even years back, and that's not the case for machine language models. So humans typically hear or read 100,000 of words. So if you extend it to a year, then it's going to be millions of time steps. So we have to vaguely remember what happened millions of time steps ago, which is still quite a bit difficult for language models to do, even though there's some approaches that can do something like that. So also the point I realized with the thought cloning. So this human-like thought step is not happening in the current language models. I think that kind of thing should be incorporated. And the video modeling may be useful sometimes, maybe not for research, but for many of the processes we need vision input. Even though there are some blind people who cannot process any vision input and still do perform very well. So maybe that's not completely needed, but it's going to be quite useful.
Totally. And then obviously, you're a source of news for so many people in the space. Besides our podcast, which I'm sure you listen to religiously, like what do you use for sources of news? And how do you kind of keep up tabs on what's going on in the space?
Yeah. My primary source is arXiv. So I think most of my information is coming from them. And the thing is that most people don't carefully read these papers, and they just skim Twitter, and so often people get confused with any research findings. So yeah, that's 80% of it. And other than that, I just talk with many different people. And nice thing is that when I reach out to any machine learning researcher, they typically respond back to me because they probably know me already. So that's a nice thing. Yeah. And also, Discord is a nice way to immediately communicate with people across the world. Yeah, that's about it, I think.
Yeah.
I don't even use...
What's the coolest conversation you've been able to have, given your Twitter presence?
Oh, in anywhere like Twitter or Discord.
Oh, yeah, or through anything.
I sometimes hear leaks from companies like Google and OpenAI from these collections, even though they are not completely reliable. So, yeah, also, even though I'm pretty active on Twitter, I often miss a lot of the news. But when I talk with people around me, then they just remind me that this happened. It's I think it's a nice way to just keep updated.
Totally. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I'm sure many of our listeners already do follow you on Twitter, but I guess, would love, one, for those who don't, and also just, generally, if you want to point folks to, any of the open source work you do, the floor is yours. Where can folks go to learn more about you and the work you do?
Oh, I'd say you can just go to my Twitter page, and I sometimes, I even sometimes talk about my own project as well. I recently started multilingual project, which happens in my Discord server. So yeah, well, please check my Twitter, I guess.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much for coming on. This is a super interesting conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.